Hey there folks, the number one Warren Zevon fan from the Infinite Jukebox here with another entry in my Rock Hall Reviews series for 2025. What is my Rock Hall Review series, you may be asking, understandably. It's a yearly series that I do on this channel where I talk about one album from each of the current year's Rock and Roll Hall of Fame nominees, give it a review, and then talk about whether I think they deserve to be in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame and whether I think they will get into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. Two questions that more frequently than you would expect or want have very different answers. And today I'm actually doing one of two bonus episodes for this series for 2025. Because, as you probably know if you are familiar with this institution, they have side categories, and most of the time I don't really have any reason to talk about them. Usually it's industry people, record execs, or in recent cases, lawyers who don't have any music, or sessions musicians, sidemen and sidewomen, whose careers are predominantly based around performing for other people, who are kind of difficult to talk about in a video album review format like I do on this channel. However, there's one other category that I used to, when I originally started this series in 2022, not really have much use for talking about, and that's the musical influence category, a category originally designed by the Hall to really honor and induct pre-rock and roll artists, people like Robert Johnson or the Ink Spots, for example. And I never really used that category in any of my videos because, quite frankly, it's just kind of impossible to. I mean, sure, I can talk about the legacy of Robert Johnson, for example, but that's kind of redundant considering you've had about 100 years of people talking about his legacy, and they aren't album artists by any sense of the word. They are singles artists at heart and predate the very concept of album artists. So I never really got the chance to talk about any musical influence inductees until the past couple of years, where they started using that for increasingly modern artists, like Kraftwerk being the biggest example, as they were at one point one of the most nominated but never inducted artists until they finally got in via the musical influence category. And now we have arguably two of the most modern artists to ever be inducted via musical influence, Warren Zevon and Salt-N-Pepa, getting in via this side category for 2025. And at this point, I feel like the Hall's just putting in whoever they feel like because they know that these artists probably aren't going to fare especially well on the primary ballot if they do get on there. So without further ado, I wanted to do little bonus videos for both of them because I feel that they are modern enough that they warrant doing videos on reviewing an album and talking about whether they deserve to get in. So without further ado, today I want to talk about the classic, indisputable, most popular album by Warren Zevon, Excitable Boy. Warren Zevon is something of a cult artist, and I think even the most diehard Zevon fans really wouldn't argue that, but I do think it's also arguable that Excitable Boy is the only album he ever put out that kind of exceeded that particular kind of legacy. I mean, obviously he's one of the most influential singer-songwriter types of his era, but he was one of the most influential while also being the alternative to your Billy Joels, Elton Johns, and other piano singer-songwriter types of the 1970s into the 1980s, whereas Excitable Boy actually produced one major hit off of it. If you somehow don't know, the absolute culturally monolithic classic song Werewolves of London. And it's honestly a brilliant representation of what Zevon stood for as an artist. It's a song that is darkly comedic with plenty of jokey lines thrown in here and there that make it feel like a bit of a silly song that you can play at a Halloween party, yet at its core, it's a deeply serious song that is implied to be about Jack the Ripper, or insert really any other serial killer of your choosing if you want to give it a different meaning for yourself. And it's pretty morbid when you look at the real center of the songwriting and themes placed throughout it. But it's put through this jaunty and upbeat kind of lens where that might not necessarily click with anyone. It sure as hell didn't click with Kid Rock when he ripped off the piano riff a few decades later, but I digress. Plagiarism aside, it's a great song, and I do think it's a beautiful representation of what Zevon represents overall. But even beyond that, you probably have the closest things to other hits that Warren Zevon, in a traditional sense, ever had. I mean, there are other songs on here that, despite not being major chart toppers or anything like that, in the way that Werewolves of London kind of was back in the day, I do feel that there are several songs on here that even your average non-Zevon fan might actually know. The biggest example, arguably, being Lawyers, Guns, and Money, a brilliant song with an amazing riff, perfect way to close out the album, some of the best lyrics of Zevon's entire career, and vocal performance is on this song, with really some of the most impressive and energetic kind of energy that he brought to the studio. It kind of almost feels like a live in the studio sort of feeling. While that's obviously not the case, if you listen to any of his live performances, live records, you kind of get the vibe that Lawyers, Guns, and Money is not that far off from the kind of vibe that he brought to the table on stage. And I think you can say a similar thing about Excitable Boy, the song that you could argue is maybe the most definitive example of Zevon's style of songwriting. I say that about Excitable Boy in particular, despite the fact that it's not his most popular, despite being a fan favorite, but specifically because it kind of demonstrates everything that made him such a singular figure among singer-songwriter types in the 70s. I mean, whereas you had your political activists against your more saccharine and personal romantics, you had Warren Zevon that made these very morbid and at times just outright somewhat mean-spirited, yet at the same time moral dilemma kind of songs. I mean, Excitable Boy, as the title track for this record, is a perfect example of that. For those who aren't aware, it's a song about a man who grows up with obviously some kind of disorder or mental condition that is completely neglected by his family, his loved ones, society around him as a whole. And eventually, as a young man, he ends up taking a girl to prom and kills her, and also does unspeakable things to her that I can't say on YouTube, or else I risk my channel getting banned, which I don't want that. Thank you. And then after he gets out of the home, he digs up her grave and he builds a cage with her bones, as one would do in that situation, of course. So it is really, in my eyes, a perfect example of Zevon as a songwriter. This song that is very dark and even outright edgy, if I'm being completely honest. Yet at the same time, once you get past the kind of over-the-top, happy kind of sounding twinkling piano riff and the backing vocalists excitedly singing the title of the track during the chorus, it manages to be a song that's a bit of a warning, a bit of social commentary, you know? I mean, sure, this main character that Zevon spins this narrative of certainly is a man who's guilty of his crime, as is explicitly stated in the song, but to an equal extent, he's kind of a victim of society in a way, you know? The point is made that he's neglected, he's told that, or other people are told that he's just an excitable boy, and in that sense, I do think that it's one of Zevon's most interesting tracks, because it really does feel like him going out of his way to not only blame the person who commits the crime, but also the people that completely choose to neglect any of the signs that he may turn out this way in the future. And you can apply that on any level you want. You can apply that to people neglecting the needs of people who have any sort of mental disorders or struggles. You can apply that to the government not doing anything to help people with those struggles. But no matter how you want to apply it, or whether or not you think Zevon intended that, it ends up being a really dynamic song that, upon first listen, may play out to the listener as just a bit of a dark joke. And I think that, at its core, a lot of Zevon's work, not all of it, but a lot of it, was kind of about that in a way. And I think it's really interesting to see in such refined form here, despite this only being a few albums into his catalog. But I don't want to imply that Excitable Boy as an overall listening experience front to back is just one dark joke after another. In fact, I would actually argue that this is one of the most dynamic Warren Zevon albums just based on tone. I mean, elsewhere here you have a lot of classic tracks that explore the more tender sides of Zevon's personality as a songwriter, something that he would certainly do more into the 80s and 90s and eventually the early 2000s before his unfortunate passing. But overall, even here, you get some really soft, vulnerable moments. Maybe the biggest example of that being Accidentally Like a Martyr, one of the best ballads of his career, or some more just genuine and honest narratives that don't really try to make a point, but just try to explore a certain perspective. You have Veracruz, for example, that is in part about the American sort of occupation, invasion of Veracruz in Mexico. You have tracks like Rollin' the Headless Thompson Gunner, one of the most brilliantly spun tales of Zevon's entire career overall, right up there, in my opinion, with Frank and Jesse James from his self-titled album, this record's predecessor. but I digress. Even the weakest track on the album, Nighttime in the Switching Yard, is still a pretty damn great song with its funk influences that provide something to the Warren Zevon catalog that I would argue you can't really get anywhere else on any other Zevon album. I mean, sure, there were other artists who did funk music, disco-influenced music, whatever you want to consider Nighttime in the Switching Yard, better than Zevon did. I won't argue against that. However, I would argue that no original singer-songwriter really did it better, because for some reason or another, there were a lot of singer-songwriter types that started out as folkies, that started out as piano balladeers, that eventually tried to get into funk music, whether that was Joni Mitchell or Tim Buckley, and it always sounded pretty god-awful for the most part. So to hear Zevon do it well for seemingly no reason other than he wanted to on one of the final tracks of this album is kind of interesting to see, and it's still something that always kind of catches me off guard re-listening to this record, despite the fact that I first heard it almost a decade ago. So overall, I really do think that this is one of the most consistent yet most ambitious albums that Zevon ever put out, and despite the fact that I think he maintained a great consistency as a songwriter over time, I don't think it ever really got better for him than this record right here. I do think that this is the peak of Zevon's powers in every direction. As a composer, brilliant melodies, as a songwriter, amazing storytelling, and a lot of genuinely funny moments that are still able to kind of catch me off guard with an off-the-cuff kind of line, maybe a really out-of-pocket kind of jokey sort of line immediately followed up by some brilliant romantic poetry. Some of the best songwriting of his career. Vocal work, pretty damn great. He was always a bit of an underrated voice, in my opinion. My point is, as a whole, I think that this record is excellently composed. I think it's brilliantly written. I think, as a whole, it's every great quality about Warren Zevon put into a pretty tight package with no real fat to trim. And I can't really hate on that in any way. I think that this is one of his best, if not his best. So yeah, overall, I'm going to give this record 4.5 stars out of 5. So that brings me to the question, does Warren Zevon deserve to be inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame? Yes, absolutely. I think it goes without question, and quite frankly, I'm surprised it took him so long. Singer-songwriter types tend to be the kind of people that the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame values the most, especially if they have a big hit or two. I'm not saying they really need to be some sort of multi-decade spanning superstar to be inducted. I mean, you already have people like Carly Simon and even Jimmy Buffett that were already inducted prior to this, and the Hall seems to love them because they're safe. And they appeal to the boomer kind of crowd that the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame is usually pandering itself towards at this point. So I can understand how all of those artists were inducted, but I kind of can't understand how Zevon was inducted only now. I mean, sure, I do understand he's a bit more esoteric, he's a bit more unique, he's a bit more left field. I would even argue, lyrically at least, a bit more experimental than the vast majority of his peers. That goes without question. But even still, I don't know, I'm just surprised it took him so long, and if I had done this series in the year that he was actually on the ballot, I probably would have predicted him to be inducted. I mean, I know I did when, the ballot that he was on was actually up a couple years back, but, I wasn't really doing this series then, so, But overall, I'm glad to see him inducted. I think that he has this legacy of influencing tons upon tons of songwriters, whether they realize it or not, to go well beyond the average love song type songwriter or the average I'm so lonely type songwriter, to create narratives, whether about themselves or fictional characters or other people or whatever it may be, to delve into an emotional side that isn't exclusively singular in terms of the emotion that it's trying to express. You have so many Zevon songs from this album and beyond that manage to express a certain kind of cynicism and heartache at the same time, while also being a bit silly, for lack of a better term, kind of joking around a little bit in some of its lyrical content. I mean, hell, even in his death, he was releasing songs as heartbreaking and as final as Keep Me in Your Heart, while at the same time putting out songs that are as completely self-aware and depressed as they are just outright comedic, with the absolutely iconic My Shit's Fucked Up. And I think it is songs like that and everything that came before it that have really caused him to be heard, whether, again, intentionally or not, in a lot of modern singer-songwriter types. I think that you can hear a bit of Zevon in everyone from modern-day MJ Lenderman to Jason Isbell. And I'm not saying that Zevon is one of those artists' primary influences, but I do think Zevon allowed for some boundaries to be broken as towards what was expected of singer-songwriters, because you really couldn't expect anything of him. He was cramming all of these ideas in terms of theme and emotion into individual songs and somehow making them work and causing them to feel so incredibly human yet uniquely his at the same time. And not to mention, the man was obviously, as goes without saying, one hell of a pianist too. So rest in peace, Warren Zevon, and I'm very glad that he's finally being enshrined where he belongs. And it seems like his family is pretty happy about it too, and that brings me a lot of joy to not only see a man who's a personal favorite of mine and a large legion of other people to finally be enshrined, but also for his family to finally see one of their loved ones get the honor that he's been overdue for quite some time. And with that being said, that is the end of this entry in the Rock Hall Review series for 2025. Thank you for watching The Infinite Jukebox, and I'll see you in the next one.